The broker's voice was a hammer. "Sold, then," he declared, his voice slick with finality. He did not look at her. He looked at the crowd, a satisfied smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "To Silas Blackwood, for the price of settling her father's debts." The words echoed in the sudden, thick silence of the town square. Sold. A word for cattle. A word for sacks of grain. Alara felt the heat rise in her face, a tide of shame so hot it felt like it might scald her from the inside out. Her father, a man she had tried to love, had not sold his land. He had not sold his tools. He had sold her. A titter of laughter broke the silence. It came from a group of women near the front, their faces pinched with a kind of cruel satisfaction. Alara knew them, had always known them. They were the mothers of the pretty girls, the slender girls, the girls who were asked to dance. "What's Blackwood want with her?" One of them whispered, loud enough for half the square to hear. "He can't fill his own fields, let alone a wife that size." Another snickered. "He needs a workhorse, not a broodmare. Everyone knows he's shooting blanks. A bare man for a fat girl. Seems fitting. Barren. Fat." The words were stones thrown, and they found their mark. Alara's hands clenched into fists at her sides, the rough fabric of her dress digging into her palms. She had learned long ago to make herself small, to absorb the barbs, to pretend she did not hear. It was a form of armor. But today, the armor had cracked. She looked from the smug face of the broker to the leering eyes in the crowd. She saw pity. She saw contempt. She saw amusement. She did not see a single shred of kindness. Her father was already gone, melting back into the crowd, his shoulders hunched with the pathetic relief of a man who had just shed a great burden. Her gaze swept the square, searching for the man who had bought her. Silas Blackwood. She knew the name, knew the ranch. Black Creek, a place whispered about with a mix of pity and scorn. A place failing, a place as broken as its owner. She imagined a man like her father, weak and desperate, or a man like the broker, cruel and calculating. Section East section, then she saw him. He was standing near the back, by the water trough, as if he were separate from the whole sordid affair. He was not what she expected. He was tall, but not in a way that commanded attention. He was weathered, his face a map of sun and wind, his clothes clean but worn. He did not look weak. He did not look cruel. He looked tired. He was looking at her. His gaze was not like the others. It was not leering or pitiful. It was assessing. He looked at her the way a man looks at a fence that needs mending or a sky that threatens rain. He was calculating something, but it felt different. It felt impersonal. It felt clean. He pushed off from the trough and started toward her, his steps unhurried. The crowd parted for him, a low murmur following in his wake. He stopped a few feet in front of her, taking the full measure of her, from her worn boots to the defiant set of her jaw. He took off his hat, a simple gesture of respect that felt so alien in this place that it almost broke her. "Miss Lowell," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones rolling in a riverbed. Alara did not answer. Words were a trap. She had learned that lesson well. The broker stepped forward, rubbing his hands together. "Ah, Blackwood, the merchandise is all yours. A bit heavy on the hoof, but sturdy. Good for work, I reckon." Blackwood's eyes flickered to the broker, a brief, cold flash of something that made the man take a half-step back. "I settled a debt. Miller," Blackwood said, his voice dropping even lower. "I didn't buy a person. There's a difference." He turned his gaze back to Alara. "I have a wagon. It's a long ride." She still said nothing. She stared at him, this strange, quiet man who had just paid for her life. She was a piece of property, and he was her new owner. The words he'd said to the broker meant nothing. They were just a different kind of performance. She would not be fooled. She would never be fooled again. She gave a single, sharp nod. He seemed to understand her silence. He turned and led the way, not looking back to see if she was following. He expected her to. Of course he did. She was his. As she walked behind him, the jeers and whispers of the town felt like a physical weight on her back. She kept her head high. She did not let them see her cry. Not here, not ever. But inside, a cold, hard knot was forming in her chest. A promise. She would survive this. She would endure him, this Silas Blackwood, and his failing ranch. She would work until her hands bled if she had to. And one day, she would be free. She would owe nothing to anyone. She would trust no one, especially not a man who looked at her with quiet, assessing eyes. That was just another kind of cage. At 2, she found her moment of solitude behind the livery stable, in a narrow, stinking alley between the wall and a pile of rotting hay. The sound of the town square were muffled here, distant and unimportant. The air smelled of manure and damp earth. It was a place of filth and forgetting. It was perfect. The strength that had held her spine rigid in the square deserted her. Her knees buckled, and she slid down the rough-hewn wall, her dress catching on splinters. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, making herself as small as she had always tried to be. And then she wept. It was not a gentle, sorrowful crying. It was a storm, a violent, racking thing that tore from the deepest part of her. It was for the humiliation of the auction block. It was for the father who had discarded her like a broken tool. It was for a mother she barely remembered, who had promised to always protect her. It was for every snickering whisper, every averted glance, every time she had been made to feel like she was too much and not enough all at once. The sobs were soundless at first, just a brutal shaking of her frame. Then they broke free, ugly, gasping sounds that she smothered against her knees. She cried until her throat was raw, until her eyes burned, until there was nothing left inside but a hollow, aching emptiness. When the storm passed, she was left with a strange and terrible clarity. The world was not a kind place. People were not good. Hope was a fool's game. Love was a lie told to get what you wanted. She had been a fool. She lifted her head, wiping her wet face with the back of her hand. Her knuckles were scraped and raw from where she had clenched her fists. She looked at the blood, a dark smear against her skin. It was real. The pain was real. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs unsteady. She leaned against the wall, the rough with a solid presence at her back. She took a deep breath and then another. The air still stank, but it was the air of her own survival. Never again, she whispered to the empty alley. The words were a prayer and a curse. Never again will I trust. Never again will I depend on anyone. She made a vow, not to God, in whom she had no faith, not to the world, which she despised. She made a vow to the scraped skin on her knuckles, to the hollow ache in her chest, to the resilient, stubborn thing inside her that refused to die. She would be a fortress. She would be an island. She would work for this Silas Blackwood. She would earn her keep and more. She would learn his land, his finances, his weaknesses. And when she had saved enough, when she was strong enough, she would walk away. She would build a life that was entirely her own, a life where no one could ever touch her, ever again. The vow settled in her, not hot like the shame, but cold and hard as iron. It was a new kind of armor. This one would not crack. B1. He was waiting for her by a simple buckboard wagon, hitched to a single, tired-looking horse. He had not come looking for her. He had simply waited, as if he knew she would need a moment, or as if he did not care. She decided it was the latter. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable. He had put his hat back on, the brim low over his eyes. "Ready?" he asked. It was not a question so much as a statement of fact. She nodded, stopping a few feet away from the wagon. She would not get closer until she had to. The broker, Miller, came bustling over, a ledger in his hand. "Just need your final mark on the debt settlement, Blackwood. Then she's officially off my books and onto yours." Silas Blackwood took the offered stylus, but he did not look at the ledger. He looked at Alara. "Miller told me the debt was for a failed shipment of seed," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying in the still air. "He said your father guaranteed it against his assets." Alara flinched at the mention of her father. She stared at the ground. "He also told me," Blackwood continued, his gaze shifting to the broker, whose smile had become fixed and uneasy, "that the girl was part of the deal, that she was lazy and useless, and her father was desperate to be rid of her." Miller laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Well, you know how it is, Blackwood. A man's got to describe his wares accurately. Blackwood's hand, the one holding the stylus, was steady. He did not raise his voice. He did not move. "I don't trade in people, Miller," he said. The words were flat, devoid of emotion, but they held a weight that made the broker's laughter die in his throat. "I came to settle a man's debt because I knew him once, and I don't like seeing his name dragged through the mud. The arrangement for his daughter was your idea, a way to squeeze a little more blood from a stone." He finally looked at the ledger, then signed his name with a single decisive stroke. He handed the stylus back. "The debt is paid. My business with you is done." He turned to Alara. "The wagon," he said, gesturing with his head. It was a command, but it was not unkind. She walked to the buckboard and climbed up, settling herself on the hard wooden bench. She kept her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She felt the eyes of the town on her, but for the first time, she also felt a flicker of something else. Confusion. This was not the interaction she had expected. He had defended her. Or not her, precisely. He had defended a principle. It was a small distinction, but it was there. She dismissed it. He was just a different kind of man, one who valued his own honor above all else. It had nothing to do with her. It was still all about him. Her vow remained. He climbed up beside her, the wagon dipping under his weight. He smelled of dust and leather and clean sweat. He picked up the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, set the horse in motion. They rolled out of the town square, leaving the whispers and the stares behind them. B2. They rode in silence for the first hour. The town gave way to open country, the road a dusty ribbon winding through rolling hills of dry grass. The sun was hot, relentless. Alara kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, on the hazy line where the pale sky met the brown earth. She was acutely aware of the man beside her, of the space between them on the bench. He did not try to fill the silence. He seemed comfortable in it. Finally, as the wagon crested a long, low rise, he spoke. "The arrangement your father made was with Miller," he said, his eyes on the road ahead. "Not with me." Alara said nothing. She waited. "I pay the debt. That's all. What happens now is a different matter." He paused, as if choosing his words with great care. "You don't owe me anything. You are not my property. You are not my servant." She turned her head slowly and looked at him. His profile was stark against the bright sky. A strong nose, a firm jaw shadowed with stubble. He was still looking ahead. "Then what am I?" she asked, her voice raspy from disuse. "You're a woman without a place to go," he said simply. "My ranch needs help. The house is a mess. The books are a disaster. I need a housekeeper. I could pay a fair wage. Room and board included." Her suspicion was a physical thing, a sour taste in her mouth. "Why?" He finally turned to look at her. His eyes were a pale, clear gray, like a winter sky. They held no guile, only a deep, abiding weariness. "Because I don't hold with what Miller did," he said, "and because I need the help." "You could have hired anyone," she countered. "You didn't have to get involved in this." "No," he agreed. "I can have. But I was there, and I saw it, and I did something about it. That's all. It was too simple, too clean. Men were not like this. Men always wanted something." "I don't trust you," she said, the words blunt and cold. It was the first honest thing she had said all day. He did not seem offended. He just nodded, as if she had confirmed something he already knew. "You have no reason to. I expect you won't. Not for a while." He looked back at the road. "At the ranch, there's a room at the back of the house. It has its own door to the outside. It has a good lock. I'll give you the key. No one will enter it but you. You're free to leave any time you want. Your wages will be set aside for you each week. When you have enough to go wherever you want to go, you can go. A room with a lock, a key, wages, the freedom to leave." These were not the terms of a master. They were the terms of an employer who understood the value of a locked door. A tiny, treacherous crack appeared in the iron wall she had built around her heart. She sealed it instantly. It was a trick, a more sophisticated trap, but a trap nonetheless. He wanted her to trust him. He wanted her to let her guard down. "I'll work for you," she said, her voice hard. "I'll earn my keep, and then I'll leave." "Fair enough," he said. And they rode on in silence once more. B3. The sun was beginning to set when they finally turned off the main road onto a rutted track. A simple wooden sign, its letters faded by the sun, read Black Creek Ranch. The land here was rougher, cut through with dry gullies and dotted with stubborn, hardy trees. It looked thirsty. As they approached the ranch house, Alara's stomach gave a loud, embarrassing growl. She pressed a hand against it, mortified. She had not eaten since the morning, and the knot of anxiety and fear had kept hunger at bay. Now, it returned with a vengeance. Silas Blackwood heard it. She saw the slight, almost imperceptible turn of his head. He did not comment. He did not look at her. He just kept driving. The ranch was a collection of sturdy but neglected buildings. A main house, a bunkhouse, a large barn, and a series of corrals. Everything looked like it needed a coat of paint, a new nail, a bit of attention. It was a place holding on by a thread. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the main house. It was a simple, two-story wooden structure with a wide porch. "We're here," he said. He hopped down from the wagon and tied the reins to a hitching post. He did not offer her a hand, but he waited for her to climb down before he moved toward the house. He led her through the front door into a large, dim room that served as both a living space and a dining hall. A long table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by mismatched chairs. The air was stale, thick with the smell of old dust and cold coffee. Dishes were piled in a dry sink in the corner. It was the home of a man who had given up. Blackwood seemed to see it through her eyes. A faint flush appeared on his weathered cheeks. "It's not much right now." She did not reply. She was cataloging the work that needed to be done. It was overwhelming, but it was also simple. This could be cleaned. Dishes could be washed. Order could be imposed. This was a language she understood. He walked past the table toward the back of the house. "Your room is this way." He stopped at a closed door and pulled a key from his pocket. It was an old, heavy iron key. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room was small and sparse. A narrow bed with a thin mattress, a small wooden dresser, a single window looking out over a field. But it was clean. The floor had been swept. The bed was neatly made, with a folded blanket at its foot. "The lock works from the inside as well," he said, gesturing to the bolt on the door. He placed the key on top of the dresser. "This is yours." She stepped inside, her hand tracing the smooth, cool metal of the key. It felt heavy in her palm. Real. He stood in the doorway, his large frame seeming to fill it. He was about to say something, then seemed to think better of it. He just nodded and turned to leave. He stopped. He turned back. "Are you hungry?" he asked. The question was so direct, so simple, it disarmed her. In her experience, her hunger, her size, her physical needs were always a source of shame, a topic for ridicule. He asked it like he was asking if she was tired or if she needed a glass of water. A simple fact. She could not find the words to answer, so she just nodded, a small, jerky movement. "I'll bring something to your room," he said. "You can eat here." He understood. He understood that she did not want to eat at that long table, under the eyes of whatever ranch hands lived in the bunkhouse. He understood that eating, for her, was a private, vulnerable act. He left, pulling the door closed behind him. She stood in the middle of the small, clean room, the iron key clutched in her hand. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock. She opened the door a crack. He was standing there with a plate in one hand and a tin cup in the other. He did not try to come in. He just handed them to her. On the plate was a thick slice of bread, a hunk of cheese, and 2 hard-boiled eggs. In the cup was fresh, cold milk. It was simple, plain food. It was a feast. "Thank you," she whispered. The words felt foreign on her tongue. He just gave a short nod and walked away. She closed the door and slid the bolt home. The sound of it clicking into place was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the plate of food. And for the second time that day, her eyes filled with tears. But these were different. They were not tears of rage or shame. They were tears of a bewildered, cautious, and terrifying gratitude. He had offered her a wage. He had offered her a lock. He had offered her food and the privacy to eat it. It was a trap. It had to be. But it was the kindest trap she had ever known. Chug. C1. Alara awoke before dawn. The thin mattress had done little to ease the aches in her bones from the long wagon ride, but she had slept. A deep, dreamless sleep, secured by the solid thud of the bolt on her door. For the first time in years, she had not slept with one ear open, listening for the heavy tread of her father returning from the tavern. She rose in the gray twilight and dressed quickly. The room was cold, but the air was clean. She looked out the small window. A vast, empty field stretched away toward a line of dark hills. The world was quiet. She did not know the rules of this new place, but she knew the rule of work. Work was safety. Work was purpose. She unbolted her door and stepped out into the silent house. The main room was as she had left it, a monument to neglect. The plate and cups Silas Blackwood had given her were on the floor outside her door, a silent testament to their transaction. She picked them up and carried them to the sink. The pile of dirty dishes was daunting. It looked like weeks of accumulated meals. She found a bar of harsh lye soap and a stiff bristled brush. There was no hot water, so she filled a bucket from the pump outside and set on the cold stove, methodically building a fire in the firebox. As she waited for the water to heat, she began to clean. She gathered empty bottles, swept up loose dirt, and wiped down the long table with a damp rag. She worked with a quiet, focused efficiency. This was a problem she could solve. Dust submitted to a broom. Grime yielded to soap and water. It was a clear, honest exchange of effort for result. When the water was hot, she began to wash the dishes. She scrubbed and rinsed, her hands turning red in the hot, soapy water. She stacked the clean plates, cups, and cutlery on the drain board, creating a small island of order in the sea of chaos. She was halfway through the pile when she heard footsteps on the porch. The front door opened and Silas Blackwood entered, followed by an older man with a deeply lined face and a limp. The old man's eyes were sharp and intelligent. They both stopped just inside the door, taking in the scene. The half-clean room, the steam rising from the sink, the neat stacks of clean dishes. Alara did not stop her work. She did not look at them. She continued to scrub a stubborn pot, her focus absolute. Blackwood said nothing. The old man, however, let out a low grunt. It was a sound of surprise, and maybe a sliver of approval. "This is Jed," Blackwood said, breaking the silence. "He's my foreman." Alara glanced up, nodded once, and returned to her pot. Jed's eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. They were like his employer's, assessing. But where Blackwood's gaze was weary, Jed's was shrewd. He looked from her to the clean dishes and back again. "Coffee's on," Blackwood said, gesturing to a pot she had set to brew on the stove. He had noticed. He poured 2 cups and handed one to Jed. They stood by the stove, drinking in silence, watching her work. She could feel their eyes on her back. She was being tested, judged, but this was a judgment she could withstand. Let them watch. The results would speak for themselves. She finished the last dish, drained the gray water, and wiped down the sink. She turned and faced them, her hands on her hips, her apron damp. "The pantry is almost empty," she said, her voice flat and businesslike. "There's flour, beans, and coffee. Not much else. The larder needs to be stocked if you expect regular meals." Blackwood looked at Jed, who raised a skeptical eyebrow. "And the stovepipe is leaking," she added, pointing. "There's a soot stain on the ceiling. It's a fire hazard." Silas looked up. He hadn't noticed. Of course he hadn't. He was a man drowning in big problems. He had no time for the small ones that would eventually burn his house down. Jed walked over to the stove and peered at the pipe, then looked at the ceiling. He grunted again. "She's right." Blackwood looked back at Alara. The weariness in his eyes was still there, but it was joined by something new, a flicker of interest. He was seeing past the woman from the auction block. He was seeing the work. He was seeing the competence. "Make a list," he said, "for the pantry. Jed will take you to town next week." "I'll need to see the books first," she said, "to know what we can afford." The request hung in the air. The books were the heart of the ranch's problems. She was asking to see the wound. Jed shot a look at Blackwood, a silent warning. But Blackwood just nodded slowly. "They're in the office. They're a mess." "I'm good with messes," Alara said. It was a simple statement of fact, and in the quiet, dusty room, It sounded like a promise. Vugie. C2. For the next week, Elara imposed her will upon the house. She scrubbed floors, washed curtains, and aired out dusty rooms. The house began to breathe again. She organized the pantry, taking meticulous inventory of their meager supplies. She cooked 3 meals a day. They were simple but hearty, and they were always on time. The ranch hands, a handful of young, wary men, started coming into the main house to eat instead of taking their plates to the bunkhouse. They were quiet, respectful. They watched her with a mixture of curiosity and awe. They had never eaten so well. Their socks were even being mended, left in a pile by the hearth and returned, clean and whole, the next day. She did not speak to them much. She did not seek their approval. She simply worked. And in the silent, masculine world of the ranch, the work spoke for her. Silas gave her access to the office, a small, cluttered room off the main hall. The ledgers were, as he'd said, a mess. Years of hasty entries, crossed-out numbers, and vague notes. But beneath the chaos, she saw a story. The story of a ranch slowly bleeding out. She began the painstaking process of creating a new set of books, transferring the old information, flagging discrepancies, trying to find the source of the bleeding. One afternoon, a crisis erupted. A shout from the fields, followed by the frantic ringing of a bell. Elara ran out onto the porch. 2 of the young hands were running toward the house, their faces pale with panic. "It's the North Channel," one of them yelled to Silas, who was coming out of the barn. "It's blocked again. The reservoir is going to top the dam." Silas cursed and broke into a run, Jed limping quickly behind him. The North Channel was the main irrigation artery for the ranch's only productive hay field. A series of small, man-made dams and channels diverted water from Black Creek to where it was needed most. Without it, the field would die. With the reservoir overflowing, the main earthen dam could burst, flooding the entire lower pasture. Elara hesitated for only a moment, then followed them. She was not a ranch hand, but she had grown up in the country. She knew water. When she arrived, the scene was one of controlled chaos. The reservoir, a large pool behind a low earthen dam, was rising alarmingly fast. The spillway that should have been carrying the excess water down the channel was completely dry. Silas and the other men were frantically digging at the mouth of the channel with shovels, trying to clear what they assumed was a blockage of silt and debris. "It's no good," Jed shouted over the sound of his own grunting labor. "It's packed in too tight. We'll never clear it in time." Silas threw his shovel down in frustration, his face grim. "We'll have to cut the dam, relieve the pressure. We'll lose the water, but we'll save the pasture from flooding." It was a devastating choice. Cutting the dam meant losing the entire reservoir, their water supply for the dry weeks to come. The hayfield would be saved from a flood, only to die of thirst later. Elara stood back, her eyes scanning the scene. She was not looking at the men digging. She was looking at the water. She saw the way it eddied near the dam, the way the current behaved. She saw the dry ground around the spillway. And she saw something else. Something the men, in their panic, had missed. She walked to the edge of the reservoir, her boots sinking into the soft mud. She looked down the length of the dry channel, then back at the dam. "You're digging in the wrong place," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the frantic energy of the men. They all stopped and stared at her. "What?" Silas asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "The blockage isn't here," she said, pointing to where they were digging. "It's further down, about 20 yards. Jed snorted. "How in the hell would you know that, girl? The water stops here. The blockage is here." "No," Elara said, her voice gaining confidence. She was in her element now. This was a system, a problem to be analyzed. "Look at the ground. It's bone dry all the way down the channel. If the blockage was here, at the mouth, there would still be seepage. The ground would be dark damp, but it's not." She pointed to a spot further down the earthen bank of the channel. "And look there. The earth has slumped. It's a sinkhole. The channel collapsed from below. The water is going straight down into the ground before it even gets a chance to back up here. The reservoir is filling up because you're not drawing anything out of it." The men were silent. They looked from her to the dry channel, to the subtle depression in the ground she had indicated. It was exactly as she'd said. Silas walked slowly to the spot she had pointed out. He kicked at the slumped earth. It gave way easily, revealing a dark, wet cavity beneath. He looked back at her, his expression one of pure, undisguised astonishment. The weariness was gone. The caution was gone. For the first time, he was looking at her not as a burden, not as a housekeeper, but as an equal, an expert. "Jed," he said, his voice quiet with awe, "get the timber shoring from the barn. We can dig out and brace it." Jed just stood there for a second, his mouth slightly agape. He looked at Alara, then back at Silas. He shook his head slowly. "Ah," he said. It was the highest form of praise he could offer. As the men scrambled to get the new equipment, Silas walked over to her. He stopped in front of her, ignoring the mud that was ruining the hem of her dress. "How did you know that?" he asked. Not a challenge, a genuine question. "My grandfather built irrigation systems," she said simply. "He taught me how to read the water, how to see the land." Silas stared at her for a long moment, 1,000 unasked questions in his eyes. He seemed to see, for the first time, the vast, untapped continent of her mind, the skill she possessed that had nothing to do with a kitchen or a sewing needle. "What else can you do?" he asked, his voice rough with wonder. Alara looked at him, at the dawning respect in his pale gray eyes. It was a feeling more powerful than gratitude, more potent than safety. It was validation. "I can balance your books," she said. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that he would let her. D1. The incident at the North Channel changed everything. It was not a shift that was spoken of, but it was felt. In the evenings, when Silas and Jed discussed the ranch's problems, they did so at the main table, where Alara was clearing the dishes. They no longer lowered their voices when she approached. Sometimes Silas would pause, turn to her, and ask, "What do you think, Alara?" Her opinion was sought on the rotation of pastures, the mending of a gear in the grist mill, the price of feed in the next town over. Her answers were always practical, logical, and built on a foundation of quiet observation. She saw the systems of the ranch, the interconnected web of water, soil, animals, and money, with a clarity that the men, lost in the day-to-day struggle, had long since lost. Her true battle, however, was waged in the small office, under the light of an oil lamp late into the night. The ledgers were a battlefield, and she was the sole combatant. She fought against years of neglect and confusing entries. But as she dug deeper, she began to realize it was not just neglect. It was something more deliberate. There were patterns, small, consistent overpayments for supplies from a particular merchant in the main county town. Sales of cattle recorded at prices well below market value, always to the same buyer. Invoices for fence wire that, according to Jed's own tallies, was never delivered. It was death by 1,000 cuts. A slow, methodical bleeding of the ranch's lifeblood, so subtle that it would look like misfortune, bad luck, and poor management. One name appeared again and again, woven through the fraudulent transactions like a poison thread. A signature on a bill of sale. A name noted as the broker for a cattle deal. A recipient of a hefty consulting fee for water rights negotiations. Fletcher Dalton. Alara knew the name. Everyone in the county knew the name. Dalton owned the largest, most prosperous ranch in the region, a sprawling empire built on his father's money and his own ruthless ambition. He was polished, charming, and sat on the county board. He was everything Silas Blackwood was not. And, according to the early pages of the ledger, he had once been Silas's friend and his financial partner. Years ago, Dalton had invested a significant sum in Black Creek Ranch, an act publicly lauded as a gesture of faith in a struggling neighbor. Alara saw it now for what it was. It was not an investment. It was an infiltration. Dalton had seeded the ranch with his own money so he could control its veins, siphoning off its strength, year after year, waiting for it to collapse. He wasn't just waiting for Black Creek to fail. He was making it fail. She sat back in a chair, the ledger open before her. The sheer, cold-blooded patience of the scheme was breathtaking. Dalton was playing a long game. He wanted the land. Not just any land. He wanted Black Creek. There was something about this specific parcel, the water rights, perhaps, or its strategic location, that he coveted, and he was willing to bankrupt his friend to get it. She spent another 2 nights confirming her theory, cross-referencing dates, prices, and names. She copied the most damning entries into a new, clean ledger of her own, creating a clear and undeniable record of the fraud. The evidence was overwhelming. Finally, she was ready. She found Silas down at the corral, repairing a broken gate. He worked with the same quiet competence she applied to her own tasks. "Silas," she said, her voice steady. He looked up, a hammer in his hand. "Alara, I need to show you something," she said. "In the office." He saw the gravity in her expression. He set down the hammer and followed her back to the house without a word. In the office, she did not speak. She simply opened her new ledger and laid it next to his old, chaotic one. She pointed to the first entry, an invoice for phantom fence wire, signed off by Fletcher Dalton. Then she pointed to the next and the next, a map of deceit laid out in her clear, precise handwriting. Silas stood over the desk, his big frame rigid as he read. She watched his face. She saw disbelief, then confusion, then a slow, dawning horror. The final stage was a cold, quiet fury that seemed to suck all the warmth from the small room. His hands, resting on the desk, clenched into white-knuckled fists. He had been betrayed, not by an enemy, but by a man he had trusted, a man he had called a friend. The financial ruin was one thing. The personal treason was another entirely. "Dalton," he said. The name was a piece of gravel in his throat. "For years," Alara confirmed quietly. "He's been strangling you." Patiently, Silas stared at the ledger, at the proof of his own blindness. He looked like a man who had been stabbed in the back and had only just now felt the knife. He pushed away from the desk and walked to the window, staring out at the land he was about to lose. "I'll kill him," he said, his voice dangerously low. "No," Alara said, stepping toward him. "That's what he wants. He's waiting for you to do something rash, to explode, so he can look like the victim, the reasonable man pushed too far by an unstable neighbor. He's been baiting you for years. Don't take the bait now." Silas turned from the window, his eyes blazing. "What else am I supposed to do, Alara? Let him take it? Let him win?" "No," she said again, her voice firm. "You're supposed to be smart. You're supposed to be patient. You're supposed to fight him with this." She tapped the new ledger. "Not with your fists." He looked at the ledger, then back at her. The fire in his eyes was met by the cool, steady calm in hers. He was a man of action, of physical solutions. She was a woman of systems, of quiet strategy. And in that moment, in that small, dusty office, he understood that he could not win this fight without her. D2. 2 days later, Fletcher Dalton arrived. He came not in a dusty wagon, but in a polished black buggy, pulled by a pair of perfectly matched, high-stepping bays. He drove it himself, handling the reins with an easy, confident air. He dressed not like a rancher, but like a banker, in a tailored suit and a crisp white shirt. He was handsome, charming, and his smile was a weapon. Alara saw him coming from the kitchen window. Her heart gave a hard, sudden thump against her ribs. It was him, the architect of their ruin. Silas was in the barn. She saw him emerge, wiping his hands on a rag, his face a mask of stone. He walked to the front of the house to meet his guest, his steps deliberate and heavy. Alara moved to the doorway of the main room, staying in the shadows, where she could watch and listen. "Fletcher," Silas said. His voice was flat, giving nothing away. "Silas," Dalton boomed, climbing down from the buggy. He strode forward, his hand outstretched. "Good to see you, old friend. I was just passing by on my way from the county seat and thought I'd stop in. See how you're holding up." Silas did not take the offer hand. He just stood there, his arms at his sides. Dalton's smile didn't falter. He dropped his hand with a smooth, unbothered motion. "Still the silent type, I see. Some things never change." His eyes swept over the ranch, taking in the peeling paint, the sagging fence line. It was the look of a vulture assessing a carcass. "Tough times, Silas. Tough times for everyone." I hear you're having more trouble than most. We're managing, Silas said. Are you? Dalton's gaze drifted past Silas toward the house. And then he saw her. He saw Alara standing in the shadows of the doorway. His smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were sharp, calculating. He had seen a new piece on the board. Well, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. What have we here? I hadn't heard you taken on new staff, Silas. Or should I say, new assets. He walked past Silas, toward the porch, his eyes fixed on Alara. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked her up and down, a slow, insulting appraisal. I remember you, he said, a look of mock recognition on his face. From the town square. Miller's little auction. You're the debt payment. The words were designed to humiliate, to put her in her place, to remind Silas of the shame and desperation that had brought her here, to establish his dominance. Alara did not flinch. She did not look away. She met his gaze and held it. She let him see the cold, quiet intelligence in her eyes. She let him see that she was not afraid of him. I'm the housekeeper, she said, her voice even. Dalton chuckled, a low, dismissive sound. Of course you are. Silas always was one for charity. Taking in strays, he turned back to Silas, but his words were still aimed at her. You have to be careful, Silas. Charity is expensive, especially when you can barely afford to feed yourself. This ranch, it needs a firm hand, a practical mind, not a bleeding heart. It was a veiled threat, a reminder of the power he held. He was the practical mind. He was the one with the money, the influence. Silas was the failure, the sentimental fool. I know what my ranch needs, Fletcher, Silas said, his voice a low growl. Do you? Dalton said, his smile finally fading, replaced by a look of predatory concern. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like it's on its last legs. I'm your partner, Silas, your friend. My investment is at stake here. If you can't turn things around, I might have to step in. For your own good, of course. To protect what's left. He was laying his cards on the table. He was preparing to make his final move. He glanced one more time at Alara, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He had expected a cowering, shame-faced creature. He had found something else, something he couldn't immediately categorize or dismiss. She was an unexpected variable, an unknown quantity. You take care, Silas, he said, turning and walking back to his buggy. He climbed in and took the reins. Think about what I said. I'm just trying to help. He drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and the stench of his false friendship hanging in the air. Silas stood frozen for a long moment, his fists still clenched. He was shaking with a rage so profound it was silent. Alara stepped out of the shadows and onto the porch. She did not look at Silas. She looked at the dust settling on the road where Dalton's buggy had been. Now you see, she said quietly. He's not just trying to take your ranch. He's trying to take your dignity, too. Silas finally unclenched his fists. He looked at her, at the unwavering strength in her posture. She had faced down Fletcher Dalton's contempt without a tremor. She had absorbed his poison and rendered it inert. The books, he said, his voice rough. Show me everything. He won. That night, the oil lamp in the office burned late again. But this time, there were two figures bent over the ledgers. Silas sat in the single chair, and Alara stood beside him, her finger tracing the lines of fraudulent numbers she had uncovered. She explained it all. The phantom invoices, the undervalued sales, the kickbacks disguised as fees. She laid out the entire conspiracy, piece by damning piece. She was not emotional. She was methodical, clinical. She presented the facts as if they were a mathematical proof. Silas listened in silence, his fury slowly cooling, reforged by the cold logic of her presentation into something harder, sharper. He had wanted to ride over to Dalton's ranch and settle things with his fists. He saw now how foolish that would have been. It would have been a firecracker against a fortress. He's been setting this up for years, Silas said, his voice filled with a bitter wonder. All this time, I thought he was my friend. He used your trust as a weapon against you, Alara said. It was his greatest advantage. And now? Silas asked, looking up at her. What's our advantage? The word hung in the air between them. Our. He had said our. He had drawn a circle, and for the first time, she was standing inside it with him. Not as an employee, not as a charity case, as a partner. A warmth spread through her chest, a dangerous, unfamiliar feeling. She pushed it down. This was not about feelings. This was about strategy. Our advantage, she said, her voice gaining a new strength, is that he doesn't know that we know. He thinks you're a fool, Silas. He thinks I'm just a fat girl you took pity on. He underestimates us. And that is an advantage we can use. Ow! We don't confront him, she said, leaning over the desk, her passion for the plan making her forget her usual reserve. We don't accuse him. We do nothing. We let him make his next move. But in the meantime, we gather our own evidence. We get sworn statements from the merchants he used. We find the real records for the cattle sales. We build a case. A solid, undeniable case built on paper and facts. When he finally tries to foreclose on you, to call on his investment and seize the ranch, we won't meet him in a field. We'll meet him in a courtroom. Silas looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, the fierce intelligence that animated her plain features. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, and he was humbled by what he saw. He had thought he was saving her from a bad situation. He was beginning to understand that she might be the one to save him. A courtroom, he repeated, testing the word. It was a foreign concept to him, a man who settled his disputes with a handshake or a hard look. He's a man of influence, Alara pressed. He sits on the county board. He has judges in his pocket. A fist fight, he can survive. He can spin it to his advantage. But public evidence of fraud, presented calmly and logically, that's a different kind of weapon. It's one he won't be expecting, especially not from us. She tapped the ledger again. This is our fight, Silas, and this is how we win it. He was silent for a long time, his gaze distant. He was letting go of his anger, his need for immediate physical retribution. He was embracing a new kind of warfare, her kind of warfare. All right, Alara, he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. We do it your way. He looked at her, a small, weary smile touching his lips for the first time that day. It seems I've hired the most expensive housekeeper in the county. You get what you pay for, she replied, and the corner of her own mouth twitched. It was not quite a smile, but it was close. In the small, lamplit office, surrounded by the evidence of a great betrayal, a quiet alliance was forged. An alliance between the stoic, principled man and the underestimated, intelligent woman. An alliance that Fletcher Dalton, in his arrogance, would never see coming. They began their silent war. By day, life on the ranch continued as normal. Silas and his men worked the fields and tended the cattle. Alara ran the house, cooked the meals, and mended the clothes. But by night, they worked together building their case. Jed was brought into their confidence. The old foreman's loyalty to Silas was absolute, and his initial skepticism of Alara had long since transformed into a grudging, profound respect. His memory for detail was encyclopedic. He remembered the phantom fence wire. Knew it, he grunted. Counted every damn roll myself. Knew we were short. He provided dates, names, and details that helped corroborate the story the ledgers told. Silas made quiet trips to the neighboring towns, speaking to merchants and liverymen. He did not accuse Dalton. He simply asked questions, gathered facts, collected copies of original invoices. He was surprisingly good at it. His quiet, non-threatening demeanor made people talk. But Fletcher Dalton was not a man to sit idle. He had sensed a change at Black Creek. The collapse he had been engineering for years was not happening on schedule. Silas had not broken. He had not come to him, hat in hand, begging for a bailout. Something was wrong. So he escalated. The attacks began as whispers. Rumors started to circulate in the main town, the same town that had mocked Alara on the auction block. They were insidious, poisonous things. That Blackwood had lost his mind, holing up on his failing ranch with that strange, fat woman. That she was a witch who had put a spell on him. That they were engaged in unspeakable acts in that dusty old house. That she was not a housekeeper, but a whore he had bought for his own private use. The rumors were designed to isolate them, to paint Silas as unstable and Alara as immoral. They were aimed at her specifically, at her most vulnerable points, her appearance, her past, her status as a woman alone. Dalton knew how to wound. Alara heard the rumors when she went to town with Jed for supplies. She felt the stares, the sneers, the sudden silences when she entered the general store. The women who had laughed at her auction now looked at her with a new kind of venomous pity. It was the old shame, sharpened to a razor's edge. She bore it with a stony silence, her face a mask of indifference. But inside, the old wounds tore open. She had built a fortress, but the poison was seeping through the walls. Then the attacks became more direct. A small fire, quickly extinguished, broke out in the hay barn one night. It was ruled an accident, a spark from a lantern. But Jed found a pile of oil-soaked rags hidden under the floorboards. A week later, 3 of Silas's best cattle were found dead near the creek, their bellies bloated. The vet called it a stomach sickness. But Alara, who had read her grandfather's old animal husbandry books, recognized the signs of poison. Silas's rage was a constant, simmering presence beneath his calm exterior. He wanted to retaliate, to strike back. But each time, Alara's quiet voice was there to hold him back. "This is what he wants, Silas. He's trying to provoke you. Don't let him win. We stick to the plan." Her resolve became his anchor. He clung to it, trusted it, even as his world crumbled around him. The pressure was immense. The young ranch hands grew nervous. They were loyal to Silas, but they were afraid. They saw the bad luck piling up. They heard the rumors. The ranch felt cursed. Dalton's final move was a masterpiece of bureaucratic cruelty. Using his influence on the county board, he called for a reassessment of Black Creek's water rights, citing inefficient use and community need. A hearing was scheduled. If Dalton won, he would gain control of the very water that kept the ranch alive. It would be the killing blow, and it would be perfectly legal. The notice of the hearing was the last straw for Silas's fragile finances. To prepare his legal defense, he had to sell off the last of his healthy cattle at a terrible price. The ranch was now truly on its knees. They were losing. Despite their plan, despite their evidence, they were losing. The weight of it all settled on Alara's shoulders, a crushing, unbearable burden. E3. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. Alara had gone to town for the mail and a few last-minute supplies. As she stood at the counter of the general store, she overheard 2 men talking by the Cracker Barrel. They didn't know who she was, or they didn't care. "Heard the county's finally going to take Blackwood's water," one said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a spittoon. "About time. Man's a fool. Let that whole place go to ruin." "It's the woman," the other said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Jed says he won't listen to reason anymore. Just does whatever she says. Place was failing before, but since she showed up, it's been one disaster after another. She's a curse on him." A curse. The word struck her like a physical blow. It was what she had secretly feared all along, that she was the source of the trouble, that her presence, her very existence, was the poison that was killing Black Creek. Dalton's rumors had found their mark. She was the fat girl from the auction. She was the whore. She was the witch. She was the curse. And she had dragged Silas down with her. She fled the store, her errand forgotten. She climbed into the wagon and urged the horse into a fast trot, desperate to escape the town, to escape the words that echoed in her head. By the time she reached the turnoff to the ranch, her mind was made up. The men were right. She was the problem. Before she arrived, Silas was just a man with a failing ranch. Now, he was a pariah, a fool being led to his doom by a cursed woman. Dalton had targeted her because she was Silas's weakness. If she was gone, Dalton would have no one to aim at. Maybe he would leave Silas alone. Maybe Silas would have a chance. She had to leave. It was the only way to save him. She drove the wagon straight to the house and went to her room. Her hand was shaking as she pulled a small cloth sack from under her mattress. Inside was the wage Silas had been faithfully setting aside for her each week. It was not much, but it was enough. Enough to get far away from here. She packed her few belongings into a small bundle. Her hands were clumsy, her movements jerky. The vow she had made to herself in that alley seemed like a lifetime ago. I will trust no one. I will depend on no one. She had broken that vow. She had trusted Silas. She had come to depend on the quiet respect in his eyes. And now, that trust was going to destroy him. She wrote a short, simple note. I am leaving. This is for the best. Thank you for your kindness. She left it on her neatly made bed, next to the heavy iron key he had given her. She was about to walk out her private door, to slip away into the twilight without a word, when she heard a frantic shout from outside. Fire! The main barn. It's the main barn. Her blood ran cold. She dropped her bundle and ran from her room, out the front door of the house. The sky to the east was glowing a sick, demonic orange. The main barn, the largest and most important building on the ranch, the one that held their winter feed, their tools, and the last of their horses, was engulfed in flames. This was not a small, warning fire. This was an inferno. This was Dalton's final, catastrophic act. As she stood frozen on the porch, watching the flames leap into the night sky, Silas ran past her, his face a mask of horror. He was shouting orders to the other men, organizing a bucket brigade from the creek, a futile, hopeless effort against such a blaze. Then, a cry of pure terror from one of the young hands. Ben! Ben is still in there. He went back for the horses. Silas didn't hesitate. He grabbed a wet blanket from the line and, without a word, ran straight toward the burning maw of the barn. Silas, no. Jed screamed, but he was gone, vanished into the swirling smoke and fire. Alara's decision to leave evaporated like a drop of water on a hot stove. All her fear, all her self-doubt, was burned away by a sudden, fierce, and terrifying clarity. She could not leave. She could not abandon this man, this place. This was her home. These were her people, and she would not let Fletcher Dalton burn it to the ground. She ran off the porch, not toward the fire, but toward the house, toward the office, toward the ledger that held the truth. The fight was not over. It had just begun. A moment later, as chaos reigned outside, Silas appeared at the barn door, half carrying, half dragging the coughing, smoke-blackened form of the young ranch hand Ben. He had saved the boy, but as he looked back at the collapsing, fiery skeleton of his barn, he knew he had lost his ranch. He sank to his knees, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. It was then that he saw her, striding toward him from the house, her face illuminated by the firelight. She was not crying. She was not afraid. Her expression was one of cold, absolute resolve. In her hand, she held the ledger. He made a mistake. Silas, she said, her voice clear and strong above the roar of the fire. He went too far, and now we're going to make him pay. He looked at her, this impossible woman, this rock in the midst of his ruin. He saw the note she had been about to leave clutched in her other hand. He understood what she had been about to do, and he understood what she had chosen instead. You were going to leave, he said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. I was, she admitted. I thought I was the problem. You're not the problem, Alara, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. You're the only thing that's not. He got to his feet, his weariness replaced by a new, grim determination. He had chosen to save a life over his livelihood. He had made the moral choice. Now, she was offering him a way to save both. He took the ledger from her hand. The hearing is in 2 days, he said. I know, she replied. I'll be ready. Effet. The fire was a funeral pyre for the old Black Creek Ranch. By morning, the main barn was a smoking, blackened ruin. The loss was absolute. Tools, harnesses, a season's worth of hay, and, most devastatingly, the 2 draft horses that were the primary engine of the farm were all gone. Ben, the young hand, was safe, recovering in the bunkhouse, his lungs full of smoke, but his life intact. Silas had not hesitated. He had run into the inferno to save one of his own, and in doing so, had sacrificed the last vestiges of his ability to operate the ranch. Fletcher Dalton had won, or so it seemed. The atmosphere on the ranch for the next 2 days was one of profound shock and grief. The men moved like ghosts, sifting through the wreckage, their faces grim. There was no talk of rebuilding. There was nothing to rebuild with. But in the house, a different kind of energy was building. A cold, quiet, and focused fury. Ilera did not sleep. She barely ate. She worked. She sat at the table in the main room, the ledgers spread out before her. The fire had not been a setback to her plan. It had been the final, crucial piece of evidence. It was the act of a desperate man, a man who had escalated from quiet fraud to open, violent destruction. It was the emotional climax of the story she was preparing to tell. Silas sat across from her, cleaning an old shotgun he had no intention of using. The repetitive, mechanical action seemed to calm him. He was a man adrift, his world destroyed. He had placed his entire faith in her plan. He watched her work, his face a mixture of awe and desperation. "He'll have an alibi," Silas said, his voice flat. "A good one. He was probably at a dinner with the judge." "I know," Ilera said without looking up from her papers. "This isn't about proving he lit the match. This is about proving why he would want the fire to be lit. It's about motive. It's about showing a pattern of behavior that culminates in this. The fire is the period at the end of the sentence." She organized her papers with meticulous care. The copied ledger pages showing the fraud. Jed's sworn statement about the phantom fence wire. The invoices Silas had collected. She even had a statement from the vet, reluctantly given, admitting that the cattle's symptoms were consistent with a specific type of plant poison found more commonly on Dalton's side of the county. She was not building a legal case so much as a narrative. A story of greed, betrayal, and ruthless ambition. A story that would be told not to a judge in chambers, but to the public, to the same people who had mocked her and scorned Silas. The night before the hearing, Jed came into the house. He looked older, more stooped than ever. "It's no good, Silas," he said, his voice heavy. "The boys are talking about moving on. There's no work here now. Nothing to stay for." Silas looked up from his shotgun, his face haggard. "Tell them to wait. Just 2 more days. Give me 2 more days." Jed looked from Silas to Ilera, who was still bent over her papers, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes bright with intensity. "All right, boss," Jed said, his loyalty unwavering even in the face of utter ruin. 2 more days. When he was gone, Silas put down the shotgun. He came and stood behind Ilera, looking down at the mountain of evidence she had assembled. "It's all on you, Ilera," he said quietly. "All of it." She finally looked up at him. The weight of his trust, of the entire ranch's future, was on her shoulders. It should have been terrifying, but it was not. It was clarifying. For the first time in her life, she was not being judged for what she was, but for what she could do. Her mind, her intelligence, her competence, these were the weapons. And she had never felt more powerful. "I know," she said. "Go get some sleep, Silas. We have a long day tomorrow." He hesitated, then placed a hand on her shoulder. It was a simple, brief touch, but it was filled with a world of gratitude and faith. He did not need to say anything else. She felt it. She was no longer the fat girl from the auction. She was the general on the eve of battle, and she was ready. F2. The county hearing was held in the town hall, the same building that overlooked the square where Ilera had been sold. The room was packed. It seemed the entire town had turned out for the spectacle. They had come to see the final, public humiliation of Silas Blackwood and the official transfer of his legacy to the powerful Fletcher Dalton. Ilera and Silas walked in together. A hush fell over the room, followed by a wave of whispers. Ilera felt the familiar sting of hundreds of eyes on her, judging her dress, her size, her presence beside the ruined rancher. But today, the shame did not stick. It slid off her like water off a duck's back. She was not here to be judged. She was here to be the judge. She carried a single, heavy leather satchel. Fletcher Dalton was already seated at the front of the room, next to his lawyer. He looked immaculate, confident, the very picture of civic virtue. He nodded gravely to people in the crowd, a concerned benefactor forced to take action against a troubled neighbor. When he saw Silas and Ilera, his expression shifted to one of deep, practiced pity. The hearing was presided over by 3 county commissioners, all of whom were friends of Dalton. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. The proceedings began. Dalton's lawyer presented their case. He spoke of Black Creek's decline, of Silas's mismanagement, of the danger the failing ranch posed to the community's shared water resources. He painted Dalton as a reluctant hero, a man stepping in to save a vital community asset, protecting his own long-standing financial interest in the property as a junior partner. When he was finished, one of the commissioners, a portly man named Henderson, turned to Silas. "Mr. Blackwood, do you have anything to say in your defense? Though, after the tragic fire the other night, I'm not sure what defense you could possibly offer. You clearly have no means of maintaining the property any longer." Silas stood up. He was not wearing a suit, just his clean but worn ranch clothes. He looked out of place, a man of the earth in a room of paper and politics. "I do have something to say," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Or rather, my bookkeeper does." He turned and looked at Alara. A murmur went through the crowd. "Bookkeeper? That woman." Dalton leaned over and whispered something to his lawyer, a smirk playing on his lips. This was going to be more amusing than he'd thought. Alara stood up and walked to the front of the room. She placed her satchel on the table and opened it. She did not look at the commissioners. She did not look at Dalton. She looked at the people of the town, the audience. "My name is Alara Lowell," she began, her voice clear and strong, filling the silent room. "For the past several months, I have been the housekeeper and bookkeeper for Black Creek Ranch." She paused, letting the words sink in. "You all see a failing ranch, a series of unfortunate events. Bad luck. I am here to tell you that it was not luck. It was a deliberate, calculated, and fraudulent campaign to destroy Silas Blackwood, orchestrated by his partner, Fletcher Dalton." A gasp went through the room. Dalton's lawyer leaped to his feet. "Objection. This is slander. This woman is a known person of low character. She has no standing here." "Let her speak," Henderson said, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Let's hear the fantasy." Alara ignored them. She pulled the first document from her satchel. Her new ledger. F3. "This is a story about money," Alara said, her voice commanding the room. She held up her ledger. "And it begins here." She proceeded to walk the entire room through Fletcher Dalton's scheme. She was no longer the timid woman from the auction block. She was a teacher, a prosecutor, a storyteller. Her weapon was not rhetoric, but irrefutable, boring, and damning fact. On April 14th, 5 years ago, she began, Mr. Dalton, as junior partner, approved an invoice for 100 rolls of fence wire. The cost was 20% above market rate. According to the ranch's foreman, Jedediah Stone, who has provided a sworn statement, she held up Jed's affidavit. That wire was never delivered. She continued, relentless, methodical. She laid out the pattern, transaction by transaction. The undervalued cattle sales, with copies of the real market rates for those dates. The overpriced seed. The consulting fees for negotiations that never happened. With each new piece of evidence she presented, a new layer of Dalton's polished veneer was stripped away. The murmuring in the crowd changed from amusement to confusion, then to dawning anger. They were seeing the same pattern she had seen. Dalton's lawyer objected again and again, but Alara never faltered. She simply presented the next fact, the next document. She had built a fortress of paper, and it was unassailable. Finally, she came to the fire. "A man who would steal a little," she said, her voice dropping, "will eventually steal a lot. A man who would cheat his friend in small ways will eventually betray him in large ways." The fire at the Black Creek barn was not an accident. It was the final move in a long game. It was designed to be the final, crushing blow that would force Silas Blackwood to surrender this land that Mr. Dalton has coveted for years for its primary water rights. "This is outrageous." Dalton himself finally exploded, his face red with fury. He stood up, his charm gone, his true, predatory nature revealed. "You're going to listen to this fat, purchased whore? This piece of livestock her own father sold off? She's a liar and a fantasist who has bewitched a desperate man." The room fell into a dead silence. The insult, raw and venomous, hung in the air. It was a fatal error. In his rage, he had confirmed everything. He had revealed the contempt he felt for anyone he considered beneath him. He had shown the crowd the man he truly was. Alara did not react. She just stood there, letting his poison hang in the air. She had waited for this. She had counted on it. Then she delivered the final, killing blow. It was a piece of logic so simple, so elegant. It was like a key turning in a lock. "Mr. Dalton," she said, her voice calm and steady, "you have made one mistake. In all your careful planning, you made one simple mistake." She pulled out one last document. It was a copy of the original partnership agreement between Silas and Dalton. This agreement states that in the event of the dissolution of the partnership, you, as the junior partner, have the right to buy out Mr. Blackwood's share at a price determined by a third-party assessment of the ranch's current value. Dalton stared at her, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "That's correct. That's what I am here to do." "Exactly," Alara said. "You are here to buy the ranch at its current, ruined value. A value you spent 5 years artificially and illegally driving into the ground. A value that was further diminished by the fire you set 2 nights ago." She paused, letting everyone in the room follow her logic. "But why would you do that?" she asked, her voice deceptively soft. "Why would you burn a barn full of assets you were just about to acquire? It makes no sense. Unless you didn't know. Unless you thought the buyout would be based on the value of the ranch from when you first invested." She looked directly at Dalton, her eyes pinning him like a butterfly to a board. "You misread the contract, Mr. Dalton. You spent 5 years destroying an asset you were planning to buy. You burned your own barn. All this time, you thought you were smarter than everyone else. But you weren't even smart enough to read your own agreement properly." The truth of it hit the room like a physical blow. The elegant, simple, and devastating logic of it. Dalton's face went from red to a pasty, sickly white. He had been so focused on the performance of his scheme that he had forgotten the fine print. He had played a long, brilliant game of chess, only to realize on the final move that he had been playing for the wrong side. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was checkmated. By her, the fat girl, the housekeeper. In the stunned silence, Silas Blackwood stood up. He walked to the table and laid the old, smoke-damaged shotgun on it. "This is what I have left of my ranch," he said to the commissioners. "Thanks to him. Now, what are you going to do about it?" G1. The town hall erupted. The carefully constructed edifice of Fletcher Dalton's reputation had not just been cracked. It had been demolished. The crowd, which had entered ready to witness a tragedy, now smelled blood. They turned on him, their whispers turning to angry shouts. They were the same people who had judged Alara, but now their judgment had a new target. They loved a winner, but they loved a fallen giant even more. Commissioner Henderson, his face pale, saw the direction the wind was blowing. His allegiance to Dalton was a matter of convenience, not conviction. He slammed his gavel down, calling for order. The county sheriff, who had been leaning against the back wall, looking bored, now pushed his way through the crowd, his expression serious. Dalton, sputtering, tried to recover, but it was too late. His vitriolic outburst, combined with Alara's ice-cold logic, had eviscerated him. He was no longer a pillar of the community. He was a common cheat, and a stupid one at that. "This hearing is suspended," Henderson announced, his voice booming. "Sheriff, I believe a formal investigation into these allegations is warranted. Mr. Dalton, you will accompany the sheriff to his office." Dalton looked around wildly, seeking an ally, a friendly face. He found none. The sheriff placed a heavy hand on his shoulder, and the fight went out of him. He was led from the room, a broken man, the shouts of the crowd following him out the door. The room slowly began to empty, the townspeople buzzing with the news, eager to spread the story of Dalton's spectacular downfall. Alara stood by the table, her body trembling with the release of tension. It was over. She had done it. She felt a wave of dizziness and gripped the edge of the table for support. Silas was there, a solid presence at her side. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a simple, steadying gesture. He did not say, "You did it." He did not say, "Thank you." He didn't have to. The gesture said it all. It was an acknowledgement, a shared victory. He had let her fight the battle, but he was there to catch her when it was over. As the last of the townspeople filed out, some of them nodding at her with a newfound, almost fearful respect, she became aware of a new sound. It was a smattering of applause, starting with a few people at the back and then spreading. It was hesitant at first, then grew stronger. The people who remained were clapping. For her. The sound was so foreign, so utterly alien, that for a moment she didn't understand it. It was the polar opposite of the laughter that had greeted her in the town square months ago. It was approval. It was vindication. Her eyes filled with tears, and this time, she did not fight them. They were not tears of shame or anger or even gratitude. They were tears of release. The final, cleansing rain after a long and brutal drought. Jed limped up to them, a wide, uncharacteristic grin splitting his weathered face. "Well, I'll be," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "Burn his own barn." "Huh." Silas finally spoke, his voice low and rough. "Let's go home, Alara." Home. The word settled in her heart. No longer a temporary arrangement, but a place she had fought for. A place she had earned. She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She gathered her papers, her weapons, and put them back in their satchel. As she turned to leave, her victory secure, she knew that she was no longer a piece of property or a charity case. She was the woman who had saved Black Creek Ranch, and no one would ever forget it. G2. In the weeks that followed, a slow transformation began. The cloud of despair over Black Creek Ranch lifted, replaced by a cautious, determined hope. The county, in a rush to distance itself from the disgraced Fletcher Dalton, not only restored Silas's water rights, but awarded him a significant portion of Dalton's as punitive damages. Dalton's assets were frozen, and a settlement was reached that would more than cover the cost of rebuilding the barn and restocking the ranch. Money began to trickle back into the ranch's accounts. The young hands who had been on the verge of leaving now stayed. Their loyalty to Silas and their awe of Alara cemented into something unbreakable. The town, in its fickle way, now treated Silas with a deep respect and Alara with a kind of revered curiosity. She was no longer the fat girl, but Blackwood's Alara, a title spoken with a mix of admiration and fear. Alara oversaw the finances with her usual meticulous care. She managed the contracts for the new barn, negotiated fair prices for lumber and livestock, and ensured that every dollar was spent wisely. The ranch was not just being rebuilt, it was being reborn on a foundation of honesty and sound management. On her foundation. One evening, after the work was done, Silas found her on the porch of the newly rebuilt house. The old, neglected structure was now freshly painted, its windows clean, its porch solid. It was a home. She was sitting on the top step, looking out at the fields, which were already showing the first signs of green from the newly secured water. He came and sat beside her, not too close but not far away either. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, watching the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. "The deed is done," he said finally. She thought he meant the day's work. "Yes, the last of the rafters went up today." "No," he said, turning to look at her. He held out a folded piece of paper. "This deed." She took it from him, her brow furrowed in confusion. She unfolded it. It was a legal document, a property deed from the county recorder's office. Her eyes scanned the dense legal text, and then she saw the names. The property known as Black Creek Ranch, formerly owned solely by Silas Blackwood, was now jointly deeded to Silas Blackwood and Alara Lowell, in equal 50% shares. She looked up at him, her heart hammering in her chest. She was speechless. "This isn't a gift, Alara," he said, his voice earnest, his pale gray eyes searching hers. "You don't owe me anything for this. This is payment for the work you've done, for what you've saved, for what you built. You earned this, every square inch of it." He took a deep breath. "And I want to be clear about something else. This isn't me asking you to marry me. This isn't me trying to trap you here. This is me acknowledging that this ranch is as much yours as it is mine. Maybe more." He looked away, out at the darkening fields. "I told you once that you were free to leave any time. That still holds true. You can sell your half, take the money, and go wherever you want. Be that island you told me you were going to be." He paused, then looked back at her, his heart in his eyes. But I'm asking you not to. I'm asking you to stay. Not as a housekeeper, not as a partner on paper, but as my partner. In all of it, I'm asking you to choose to stay. G3. Alara looked down at the deed in her hands. The paper was crisp, the ink dark and official. It represented a world she had never imagined for herself. Ownership, permanence, a place. Her name was on it, a solid, undeniable fact. Alara Lowell. She thought of the vow she had made in the alley, the vow of iron and ice. To be a fortress, to be an island. It had been a vow born of pain and betrayal, a vow to protect herself from a world she believed was only cruel. But this man, this quiet, principled man beside her, had shown her a different world. He had not rescued her. He had given her a key, a wage, and the space to rescue herself. He had seen her competence when others saw only her form. He had trusted her mind when everyone else, including herself, had trusted nothing. She had come to Black Creek to earn her freedom. She had planned to save her money and leave, to build a life where she owed nothing to anyone. But somewhere along the way, in the quiet evenings spent over ledgers, in the shared crisis of the fire, in the silent understanding that passed between them, the ranch had become more than a workplace. It had become a home, and he had become more than an employer. He had become her anchor, her partner. To leave now would not be an act of freedom. It would be an act of self-exile. She would be leaving behind the only place she had ever truly belonged. She looked up from the deed and met his gaze. His face was filled with a quiet, vulnerable hope. He was not commanding her or indebting her. He was asking. He was giving her the one thing no one else ever had, a choice. "I told you once that I was good with messes," she said, her voice soft. A small smile touched his lips. "You did. This place is still a mess, Silas," she continued. "The books are balanced, but the fences still need mending. The south pasture needs to be reseeded. The new horses need to be broken in." "I know," he said, his hope faltering slightly. "It's a lifetime of work," she said. She carefully folded the deed and held it out to him. He looked at it, his expression falling, believing she was returning it. "You should put this in the strong box," she said gently. "Our strong box." The relief that washed over his face was so profound it almost buckled him. He took the deed, his fingers brushing against hers. The touch was electric, a current of shared understanding. "Alara," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not staying because I have to, Silas," she said, her voice clear and sure, a final declaration of her own hard-won agency. "I'm not staying because you gave me this," she tapped the deed. "I'm staying because I want to. I'm choosing to stay." She was choosing her home. She was choosing her future. She was choosing him. He didn't say anything. He simply reached out and took her hand. His hand was rough and callous from a lifetime of hard work. Hers was strong and capable. They fit together perfectly. They sat there on the porch of their house, hands clasped, watching the first stars appear in the vast, quiet sky. The sounds of the ranch, the lone nicker of a horse, the chirp of crickets, the sigh of the wind through the new timbers of the barn, were a gentle symphony. It was the sound of peace, the sound of a new beginning. She was not an island. She was a harbor, and she was home.